Mark Hetfield, president and CEO of HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, is what it used to be called. You've been involved in humanitarian issues for the whole of your adult life. The election that has just taken place in the United States marks something of a turning point, I think, for a lot of people. What are you hoping for in terms of the immigration question to come out of the next administration?
Well, I mean, there's the immigration question and there's the refugee question. And HIAS primarily focuses on refugees, which of course are immigrants, migrants who flee persecution and who need protection. That being said, in the United States, we have not changed our immigration laws since 1986. And so we have 12 million undocumented immigrants living in this country. And that's putting a lot of pressure on asylum seekers as well, who are trapped inside this huge immigration court backlog of over 1 million cases. The asylum backlog is over 500,000 cases right now. It's a mess. And our hope from the election is that this mess is going to be cleaned up and that it's going to be cleaned up in a humane way. But frankly, with the constellation of the Congress being what it is, it will be difficult to do anything legislatively.
That's something that non-Americans always miss out on. A presidential election looks like there's a sharp break, but in fact, the United States, the framers, the founders of the United States, created a bicameral House, and they created a division of powers between between Congress and the presidency. What impact, though, does the president have on questions like refugees and immigration? I mean, even if it's rhetorical and setting the tone, how significant actually is that?
That's where it is very significant. I mean, there are two things we have to look at: what the United States says and what the United States does. And I'm really optimistic that over the next 4 years, America will once again lead in the area of refugee protection globally, and also will do it by example. All of the terrible anti-refugee measures that were executed over the last 4 years will be undone. America will once again welcome refugees to our country. The United States is welcoming 15,000 resettled refugees this year, the lowest number in the history of the refugee program. President-elect Biden has promised to bring that number up to 125,000. And when you're allowing in 125,000 refugees who are fleeing persecution, that is leading by example. That's demonstrating to other countries that the United States is willing to share their responsibility for the displaced. And of course, there are more displaced people now than there have been at any time in human history. So it's really important to have that leadership. What America does matters, and what America says matters. And for the last 4 years, we've been saying and doing the wrong things.
It's both a cliche and a reality that the United States is pretty divided politically. And questions like immigration and refugees and asylum seekers can become the kind of issues that raise temperatures, raise emotions, and also get people to be even more tribal than they usually are. How do you reach across the divide? How do you reach people in the United States who are concerned about refugees and the abuse of the asylum seekers situation? What kind of message? It's easy to preach to the choir, to the converted. How do you get to people who are skeptical about the United States and its obligations, or whether they should in fact be obligations to refugees around the world?
Yeah, Robin, that is the toughest nut to crack, frankly. I mean, we know that we're a very divided country, and we know that one of the issues that divides us is immigration. And there's a real fear of the other. And that fear, instead of being addressed over the last 4 years, has been exacerbated, exploited by our own national leadership. And so what we have to do is try to demonstrate that there is no reason to fear refugees, that refugees and immigrants have in fact been one of the factors that have made this country so incredibly strong. There was a study at the beginning of the Trump administration trying to show that refugees were a huge cost to the American taxpayer. What that study actually found was that over time, refugees have contributed $63 billion more in taxes than they took in services. I mean, $63 billion from resettled refugees. So we have to demonstrate to the American people, not just these statistics, but we have to make sure that they get to actually know refugees rather than being fearful of whom they don't know. So it's really important to enhance community involvement in working with refugees and asylum seekers in their new communities. That's really job one, is trying to familiarize Americans with who refugees and asylum seekers really are.
Looking at questions of refugees and how to deal with the refugee question in the bigger picture, there is always the issue of the reasons why people actually leave their countries in the first place. Most people actually don't want to leave their homelands. They feel very happy there, except that they have either very difficult economic circumstances, political oppression, they might be subject to natural disaster. What role should the United States be playing in addressing the root causes of the reasons why people in the first place feel the need to leave their homelands?
Addressing the root causes is the most important place where the United States needs to demonstrate leadership. Resettlement is not going to solve problems, right? Resettlement is a solution that's available for less than 1% of the world's refugees. What we really have to do is make it safe for them to go home and to want to go home. So many Syrian refugees have said to me over and over again that Syria was the safest country in the world until it became the most dangerous. And we have to work to make their people's home countries safe so they can return. That's certainly true with Central America. It's true with Venezuela. It's true with Syria. I mean, there's a lot of work to do, and the entire international community has a role to play in it. In fact, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, when he was the High Commissioner for Refugees, he really started to try to address root causes, I think almost preparing for his next job. But that work is still undone. I mean, that's going to take the entire international community to solve.
I mean, it takes the entire international community, and it also takes not just a 1 or 2 or 4 year plan. These are decades-long issues, aren't they? I mean, it's like, if you look at the post-war reconstruction in Europe, the post-Second World War reconstruction, I mean, it still takes decades, even where you have essentially a very advanced infrastructure in place. You have education systems, you have sewage systems, you have medical systems, you have all this. But the places that many refugees come from don't necessarily have that. Or if they do, they're very divided societies, like Venezuela, perhaps would be a good example. I mean, Venezuela does have a middle class, although it's probably best not to call it middle because it's very much at the top of society, whereas 90% of the population lives in conditions that most Americans, most Britons would consider to be squalid and so on. Is this also part of the package of persuading people who have a sort of innate reluctance to welcome refugees in America that, if we have an outward reaching, and not just the United States, everyone has their obligations amongst the wealthier countries, an outward reaching, an outward thinking infrastructure policy, a policy like the Marshall Plan, that will ultimately, it almost sounds perverse to say this in a certain sense, but if you're worried about too many refugees coming into your country, well, actually, you can support your government by asking them to stop the problems in the first place, such as the oppressive regime in Venezuela, and such as broader problems like global poverty. I mean, how does one make a policy like that work so that people across America can believe in it?
That's absolutely true, Robin. That's why we have to care about refugees, because they may be a problem over there, but they're going to be a problem over here if you don't address their problems over there. People are going to flee to wherever they have to flee to save their lives and to put their children in a safer place. And this is something Europe learned the hard way back in 2015. I mean, when I was working in refugee issues from 2011 to 2015 during the explosion of the Syrian refugee crisis, it was just unbelievable that you would see hundreds of thousands and then millions of refugees going from Syria into Turkey, into Jordan, into Lebanon. And the rest of the world did almost nothing. I mean, almost nothing as these countries just reach their saturation points hosting asylum seekers from Syria until ultimately they basically close their borders. And then all of a sudden, when after they reached their saturation points, the refugees took it upon themselves to move to Europe, to risk their lives, fleeing through the Mediterranean, to drowning. I mean, it was the image of Elan Kurdi's body on the 2-year-old Syrian boy's body washed up on the beach in Turkey, which woke all of us up about the extent of the refugee crisis in the Middle East. And that crisis then came to Europe. And now we have the same issue going on in Central America, in the Western Hemisphere, and in Venezuela, where Venezuelans are now all over the Americans because they could not live in Venezuela given the economic and the political turmoil there. So if you don't solve the refugee problem, it's going to become your problem. And again, refugees are a great asset over the long term. But over the short term, it is very difficult for a country like Jordan, a small country like Jordan, to absorb 700,000 Syrian refugees. They need help, and we need to make sure we can build back the countries that they flee from and try to establish stability so people can go home.
As a final question, I detect a certain, even in discussing something as fraught and difficult, and in many cases tragic as the refugee question, I do detect a certain optimism. Are you an optimist about what President Biden, when he becomes President Biden on January the 20th, can achieve? Is there a sense to you personally and in the communities like yours who work in refugee questions that we may be entering and we should be entering a new era, and things can actually change for the better?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, leadership really matters. It's tough because the entire refugee global framework, the entire global operating system for refugee protection was written in 1951 to address the displaced persons crisis in Europe, and it has not been changed. So we're dealing with some very old machinery to solve a very different problem than it was back in the early 1950s. That being said, the United States and President-elect Biden have the resources to really demonstrate to the rest of the world that we are committed to working with them to solving the refugee crisis. And if we do that, if every country pitches in, it really can be done. It's not an impossible task. And the United States did this back in 1980 when we resettled 207,112 refugees during the Indochina boat crisis. And that really, those kinds of numbers really make a difference, really set an example, and we were able to get that situation under control. But it's going to take some commitment. And again, if we don't do it now, the problem is going to come back to haunt us later.
Mark Hetfield, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Robin.